a pair of verses in the Gita. And I think a lot of arguments in the world and a lot of disagreements and discord are caused by people creating artificial dichotomies. And so a dichotomy is when you have two mutually exclusive options. So you got to choose between two things, and it's truly two different ideas. It's truly two different ideas. And they're mutually exclusive. You got to pick one or the other. In a sense, this is similar to what would be there in a zero-sum game. A zero-sum game has exactly one winner and exactly one loser. And if you win, the other party has lost, and if they win, you've lost. It's zero sum. Sum is, whatever the amount is. They either won 1 point or they won 100. It doesn't matter, but they've won something. And if they've won something, then it means that you have won nothing and you've in fact lost. So dichotomy creates that kind of a situation where you're choosing A or B. A does not include B. B does not include A. They represent two distinct choices, and those choices are mutually exclusive, and you got to pick one or the other. We're taught to think like this. Bubble tests are designed with this premise in mind. And so much of the standardized testing that goes on throughout most children in the U.S. and the way they're taught growing up, standardized testing uses this model where you can do A, B, C, D, or E, and one of those answers is right and all the other answers is wrong. The problem is that sometimes life doesn't work like that. For example, consider a situation where you have exactly $100 and you have exactly 5 children. And it's Christmas. And you want to use that $100 to buy presents for your children for Christmas. Do you, A, divide up the money equally, $20 each? Do you, B, give more money to the older children who, generally speaking, prefer more expensive gifts? And if you have a 2-year-old or a 1-year-old, usually you don't have to spend the full 20 on them. They don't even know. They're going to play with the wrapping paper that the gift comes in more likely than they're going to actually play with the gift. Do you divide up the money by whether they're boys or girls? You get 2 boys and 3 girls. You give the boys $40 collectively. You buy one gift for the boys. $60 collectively. You buy one gift for the girls. Do you buy one gift for the whole family that everybody can use? Do you look at one child who's had a particularly rough year? Maybe they suffered an illness and they were out of commission for most of the year, and you give, $50 to them. And then the other 4 children, you give them $12.50 each, which you equally divided up amongst them. Did 2 kids have a rough year? And so you give them $40 each and divide up the remaining money amongst the remaining children. Which one of those is the right answer? Any of those answers are justifiable and reasonable. Any of those answers can have good, solid logic behind them. They're justifiable And really, when you make a choice, which one of those you're going to do. There is no right or wrong answer. There's a choice combined with some reasoning that went into that choice. A lot of things in life are like that. Who do you marry? How many kids do you have? Where do you vacation? What movie do you choose to watch? Which restaurant do you choose to go to? What jacket do you buy when you go to the store? So many things in life that we do on a daily basis have as much to do with free will and choice as they do with picking the right answers. And some of them are entirely about your free will and choice. And there is no logical right answer. That doesn't mean that your choice is illogical. What it means is that you can have good logic behind a number of choices. That's another artificial dichotomy. If something is not based solely on logic, then there can be no logic behind it whatsoever, and it's totally arbitrary. But in fact, you can make a choice, which is a choice, which is not solely based on logic, and you can still have good reasons and good logic behind what you do. And so those two things aren't mutually exclusive. The reality that so much of life consists of free choice and does not derive from logic does not mean, therefore, that those free choices do not enjoy a logic or enjoy reasoning. And in fact, both things can be present, and it becomes much more about the nuanced combination of free choice and good reasoning that weighs into the bulk of decisions you make in life. We think of the world in bubble test terms because we were trained to do that, and it makes things easy. But reality is a lot more fuzzy, with a lot more shades of gray. It's a lot less black and white than we might prefer. Even within logic, you have deductive logic, which ends up with valid and invalid answers, which are true or necessarily false, necessarily true or necessarily false. But you also have inferential logic, and so much of logic is inferential, where you test a drop of water and it's salty, and so you then extrapolate that the entire ocean must be salty. You can't know that for sure, but you're able to infer that reasonably. Inferential logic is always strong or weak, as opposed to true or false. You'll have good reasons. It'll be more likely than not to be true. There'll be strong arguments for it, or there'll be weak arguments for it. But the very nature of inferential logic is it's not as set in stone, 100% true or 100% false. Then you have modal logic, which largely gets used in the rigorous determining of probability and possibility, which is a whole nother very, very serious system of logical calculation based on necessity and possibility. Even within an extremely hard field, like the field of logic, there are different types of arguments that enjoy different levels of certainty. And many things in life are not subjectable to a deductive logical argument. You can't syllogize them and make them 100% true or false. They themselves are, how do you know somebody loves you? How do you prove love? You don't prove love the same way you prove temperature. But the value of love and the necessity of love, especially among social mammals like human beings, is as important, more important than a precise measurement of temperature. But yet somehow or other, love is not as easily provable, as mechanistically provable as something like temperature. Or we can get even less airy-fairy than love, and you can look at the reality of other people being conscious. But because consciousness is always experienced in the first person, it is not possible to demonstrate effectively third person, scientifically and empirically, which means objectively and third person, someone else's consciousness, because the very nature of consciousness is that it must be experienced in the first person in order to be sure it exists. So at best, we can prove the symptoms of consciousness, which could theoretically exist in a philosophical zombie, a person possessed of the ability to react to stimuli as if they were conscious, although devoid of consciousness. And we certainly find that with regard to empathy with sociopaths. That there's a group of people, a certain percentage of the population, I believe it's around 1% of the population, that's so severely curtailed in their experience of empathy that for all intents and purposes, they don't experience empathy. But they will behave as if empathetic, and they'll learn to cry on cue and behave in normative ways so they don't seem like total freaks. But what's going on the inside as they're deploying those carefully sculpted behaviors is nothing like what you experience, unless you're a fellow sociopath. And so, not only do we see the approximates or the symptoms of empathy, we also see the approximates or the symptoms of consciousness, but those are not the same as the actual subjective experience of empathy and consciousness, which are the least doubtable truths in existence, because all other truths are dependent on you being conscious in order to be able to experience them. Therefore, your own consciousness is the least doubtable and most basic feature of reality. But yet it's not empirically demonstrable to anybody else on the planet except for yourself, who's experiencing it in the first person. This reality gave rise to an entire field of philosophy called phenomenology in the last couple centuries. I don't know if everybody followed what I just said. It did make sense, but I moved relatively quickly, and I didn't slow it all down because it's not what I want to talk about today. But the sum and substance of what I'm trying to communicate is that we are taught to fill out bubble tests, and even with really cool apps like Waze, where you plug in where you want to go, and it gives you real-time updates. It's still based on the bubble test model. There's an operating premise. The operating premise is that you want to get there as quickly as possible. If you deviate too much from the original course, or if traffic gets too bad, they'll then suggest alternate routes, but the alternate routes are calculated algorithmically based on what's going to get you to where you want to go as quickly as possible. And so even though you have these unlimited variables that are being quantified and even guessed at, it's not that it's all in real time. There must be some algorithmic estimation going on with those apps. They must be built like that. I don't know exactly how they're built. But you've got all these variables, they're getting plugged in, and then there's some operating system algorithm which is quantifying everything and guessing and filling in the blanks. And it comes up with one answer, or maybe two. One answer if you're willing to pay tolls, one answer if you're not willing to pay tolls. But how about the pleasantness of the journey? How about the scenicness of the journey? The value of taking the 101 freeway to San Francisco as opposed to the 5. There's a value in that. How about the value you might place in, even if you drive slower, not having to stop? Jai Dave, my oldest friend, Jai Dave, the most important thing to him when he drives is that he never stops his car. He'll make a right turn and a U-turn and take a different route just to avoid as much as possible having to stop. Somehow that act of stopping and going and stop, that's jarring to him. And being able to just continue and be a body in motion has a value. How do you quantify that? You could actually. You could calculate the scenicness. Those are relatively static features. You could quantify the likelihood of rain. The whole Waze app is designed on top of a bubble test model, that there's always going to be one answer. And life is simply not like that. Life oftentimes involves polarity management, where you have two competing ideas and you simply have to honor and serve both of them simultaneously, even though they are opposed to one another. For instance, let's imagine you have centralization, and the opposite of centralization is decentralization. So you have these two realities, and they are actually opposites. I mean, they're even expressed in speech. Centralized, decentralized. They're opposites. They're true opposites. Which one of those is most important for business? They both are. Decentralization fosters creativity. Centralization helps you deal with things like quality control and bringing down the cost of goods and supply chains and so on and so forth. Any good business has to employ aspects of centralization and decentralization at all times, even though those things are at odds with one another. You have the waterfall method of project management. Essentially, you just order everything so it all just falls into place like dominoes. And you have the Scrum method, which has become the standard as you're doing coding and working on with development of apps, for example. Because the marketplace is changing so rapidly that if you try to organize your entire project, by the time you finish your project with delays, the market's changed and your app is no longer viable and you've lost your market share. So a scrum is when, in a game of rugby, the two teams, all 15 men on both sides lock up arm in arm, and they go head to head against one another, and they try to move the ball just a little bit in one direction, and the scrum will break up and the play will continue. But it's a particular way, almost like a football play, but without pads and with all the men linked up arm in arm, and they're trying to move the ball a few inches. And so Scrum theory has you getting together for a couple of weeks and moving forward with your app, and then after a few weeks or a month, you have to have a whole other meeting and decide on the direction you want to take your app in, because the market is changing so rapidly. There's so many variables that you can't make an entire plan like a farmer would. You can only make a short-term plan, and you have to reassess what direction you should go in, and maybe even redesign the basic idea behind your app. And you have to be open to that, otherwise you're an old man in the year it takes you to develop your app. Do you follow this? These managing of polarities, centralization, decentralization, an assured system of project management versus innovating while you're involved in managing the project. Normally, by the time you get into project management, you've determined what you're going to do, how you're going to do it, and now it's just a question of carrying out those steps. But what if you have to regularly redefine what it is you're even doing throughout that process? That's crazy, right? But that's also reality. It's the standard model used when you're doing things like developing apps nowadays. You get this when you're designing, let's say, a website for somebody, and you ask them to tell you everything they want, and then you have to build into that process a bunch of add-ons, because there's no human being on the planet who knows exactly what they want from the get-go and then doesn't change their mind and think, oh, could you add this feature? Could you add this? Or how about doing this? And it's the bane of website developers or app builders, that people have an idea, you then tell them what's going to cost them, and then they start morphing it on you while you're working on it as they have different innovative ideas and they see something new and they call you up and say, what about this? Or add this, and then they get freaked out when the price is 3 times more than you originally quoted them, because you ended up doing 3 times the work, because half the stuff when I was a kid, there was a garage, a gas station with a mechanic attached, which was the norm back in the day. You would have a gas station with a mechanic attached. And they were all highway robbers, and there was no way to, let the Better Business Bureau know, and so that everyone would find out about it, and they would just rip you off. But I remember that one of these garages, I would hang out down there sometimes with the mechanics, and they had a sign on the wall, and it said, price per hour for labor, $50. Price per hour for labor if you want a watch, $60. Price per hour for labor if you want to help, $75. Because it's one thing to do your work, it's another thing to do your work with somebody standing over your shoulder, it's another thing to do your work with somebody trying to help you. It actually makes it more painful. It doesn't help. So the point I was making was that life is messy. Life is fuzzy. Life doesn't have clear-cut dichotomies. Life involves things like free will and choice. And those things aren't blind and arbitrary. There's oftentimes really good reasoning behind people's choices. But it's just not absolute the same way deductive logic is. It's much more inferential. It's much more modal. It's much more about probability and possibility. It's much more about weighing different polarities and different things that have to be held together. And life is actually of that nature. Even the study of things like consciousness is of that nature. Empathy. Really important stuff. Basic stuff. Stuff that's arguably way more important than the precise calculation of temperature or air pressure for most people. Empathy and love and choice and kindness. These things are the most important for most people. We spend the most amount of our time looking at these things. They are actual features of reality that oftentimes get left out of an objective study because an objective study can't possibly calculate them. Do you follow this? So I want to look at a pair of verses from the Gita. And there is a general feature within Hinduism where they divide the world into 2 neat categories, 2 clean, dichotomized categories. Amazingly, Western religion has not figured this one out yet. It's bizarre. These are such obvious categories. They are the first category that a religion should look at. They're the most important thing for a religion to look at, objectively speaking, when you look at a tradition in its entirety and the focal point of a religion, which is namely the belief in God and God's connection to reality. Somehow or other, Western thought still today does not have any language to express these 2 basic categories of thought, which in a lot of ways are black and white. They're very, very clean and they're very distinct. And those two things are personalism and impersonalism. And those terms, personalism and impersonalism, are coined by me and others because there's no actual language you can go to on a Wikipedia entry which will help you understand these two things. Therefore, we have to use terms like personalism and impersonalism and then explain what they mean. And be better off saying Dvaita and Advaita, but even those terms are approximations. You could also use the term Vaishnava and Shaiva, but those terms don't do a perfect job of it either. And so, bizarrely, in English especially, but even to some extent in Sanskrit, there is not a clean language to describe this. And even Dvaita, Advaita gets modified tremendously. So anyway, let's get these two ideas on the table so we can start to work with them. Dvaita, or personalism, or Vaishnavism, is the idea that ultimately God is your parent. Maybe not even in time. You could also be an eternal being. But God is your parent in the sense of you derive your existence and you're ontologically dependent on the deity, the same way that an eternal thought, even if it's eternal, is still fundamentally dependent on an eternal mind in order for it to exist. And so you could theorize a mind and a thought existing outside of time, even though it's vexing and it's difficult because we are trained to think linearly and through time in the same way we're trained to think in dichotomies, like on bubble tests. There's one answer and only one answer. But you could, if you stretch your mind a little bit, conceive of existing outside of time in perpetuity. And if you existed outside of time in eternity, then when you have a thought, how long has that thought existed? Forever, because you exist outside of time. So you could have thoughts, and those thoughts would exist forever. Which means they've always existed, and they always will exist, because you're located in a space outside of time, and therefore time is not quantified, and there is no meaning to the statement that if I had this thought then, and then this happened, and then that happened, because you're actually stepping outside of time into a land where every moment is eternal and every thought is eternal. You follow? Now you have an eternal thought. Is that eternal thought dependent on an eternal mind? Yes, it is. But it's not dependent in the sense that there was no thought and then there was a thought. The thought's always existed, the mind's always existed, and yet still the thought has always been dependent on that eternal mind for its existence. It's ontologically dependent as opposed to temporally, spatially dependent. Did you guys follow that? Okay. So you could, theoretically, certainly our tradition actually does this. We believe we're eternal beings and we've always existed, yet we're still dependent on a creator who didn't create us within time, created us outside of time, but yet we're still dependent on the creator. And there is a fundamental concrete distinction between you and your creator, and that distinction carries with it some benefits. You can love your creator, because love is a unifying force that exists between two people, and without two people being individual, they can't enjoy love. Imagine if a child disappeared and went back into its mother's belly and didn't exist anymore as a concrete, distinct entity. Would the mother be able to love that child? No, she would not. Love is a unifier, which brings together a lover and a beloved, but it amazingly depends on there being a distinction between the lover and beloved in order for it to work its magic and bring two people together. Vaishnavism, personalism, Dvaitavad, if we were going to sum it up simply, it would be the idea that you came from God and you are distinct. And because you are distinct, there is the possibility of a relationship with God based on love. And so for all Vaishnavas, personalists, Dvaitavadis, they all have an idea of a place like heaven, where you go, where you serve along with and relish the enjoyment of and exchange love with divinity in perpetuity. They have a conception of heaven, or Vaikuntha, or the Pure Land for Pure Land Buddhists. They have this idea. Why? Because you and God are distinct enough that you can have a relationship, and that relationship can exist in perpetuity. And if we go up to heaven, we'll find Ryan and Katie there with angel wings and harps floating around, castratedly floating around Jesus in a big block party in the sky. But they will be there, and we'll be able to say hello to them, and they'll be able to say hello, good morning to Jesus, and they'll be able to high five Jesus and play in the church band with electric instruments with Jesus, but there will be some ability for them to interact with divinity. That's option A. Option B, every experience you have of individuality ever, every experience you have of variety ever, every unique, individual, personal, conscious experience you have of reality is all an illusion. And spirituality ultimately consists of disintegrating every distinction, every variety, every unique attribute that separates you from anyone, until eventually everything fully and completely becomes homogenized as one. And you are me, and I am you. And there's no even thought, because a thought is distinguished from the rest of reality. So there's no even thought. There's no love, because love is based, again, like I mentioned, on a lover and a beloved. There's no form. There's no desire, because the desire can be separated from the person having the desire. There's no variety whatsoever, because any type of variation whatsoever starts to make a distinction between two things, and distinction is the enemy, because ultimately everything is, and always has been, and always will be, exactly one. And in that tradition, the goal of life is to erase differences. The difference of your form from his form. The difference of your mind from his mind. The difference of you from your thoughts. The difference of you from your feelings. The difference of an exchange between you and another person, such as love or empathy or compassion. And all those things, love, empathy, and compassion, become facets of illusion, because everything has always been and will always be one. These are two truly distinct ways of viewing the world. They're hard distinctions. It's a true dichotomy. And this is critical, because it colors the way you think about God and yourself in relationship to God, and what your goal is of practicing spirituality, and how you navigate things like love and feeling, individuality, and even thought. Your orientation towards those things. Are those things the enemy, or are they your friends? And it's awful that we don't have a language to describe this in Western philosophy. It's a shame, and it makes me think that all Western practitioners of religion are idiots who have never thought deeply about the subject that they're engaged in. Because it seems to me impossible to think deeply about the nature of God and yourself without answering these basic questions. They are the most fundamental questions of a religion. Who am I? What is God? What is our relationship? And without thinking these things through, you're almost in a preschool phase of spirituality. Now, I don't think Western religion is as bad as I just made it out to be. I was being a little bit melodramatic and hyperbolic. I think what's happened is Western philosophy never had this oneness concept deeply woven within it. Somehow it escaped Christianity and Islam. And so it just they've never thought there was another option besides there being two forever. They grew up in a dualistic world where there was God and the devil, you and the others, in warring tribes in the Middle East, fighting over small oases. And so they just always assumed it was us versus them. And so that became the model of their tradition. The Greeks got into this stuff. Plotinus, for example, amongst the Greeks got into this stuff. Plato to some extent, but his followers more. And Judaism got into a little bit of this. And the Kabbalah, Sufism and Islam got into it. There's a bunch of Christian mystics that get into this stuff. So it exists, Meister Eckhart, amongst others. It's not that you don't find impersonalism crop up in these other traditions. It's just it wasn't there from the beginning. And so people must have figured it out along the way, or they maybe inherited it from the East and then brought it into their tradition. But there's a very strong sense in which maybe 2.9 something billion Christians and 1.9 billion something Muslims, 4.8 of the 5 billions of Christians and Muslims in the world, never even think about this stuff. It's too heady for them. And so it's left to the realm of theologians. But anybody who's serious about thinking about the way they think about God has to contend with this. Who am I eternally? What is God eternally? What is our relationship? Two hard categories. But actually, they're not quite so hard a category after all. I was lying to you and being hyperbolic when I said they're two different categories. These things are much more like polarities that need to be managed. They're much more fuzzy than we teach them. We teach them didactically, we teach them as being one and the other because it's easier and it makes sense and it trains people. It's like the bubble test. But the actuality is a lot more complicated. And it involves a lot more polarity management. It involves a lot more free will. It involves a lot more nuance, but still with logic and reason behind it. For example, Vaishnavism has traditions like Vishishta Advaita, qualified oneness, variegated oneness. Vishishta means Vishesh, means variety, variegated oneness. So it's oneness, but it's variegated. You know what we call the soul in our tradition? Huh? Vibhina angsa. Separated part. Angsa means part. Vibhina means separated. Our relationship to Krishna, we are Vibhina angsa. We are a separated part. Well, if you're separate, you're not a part of something. If you're part of something, you're not separate. But yet we say separated part. If it's one, it's not variegated. If it's variegated, it's not one. But yet we say variegated oneness. Shuddha Advaita. Purified oneness. The purification here being an acknowledgement of variety. Dvaita Advaita. That's another one. Dualism and oneness. There's actually a tradition called Dvaita Advaita. If you call your religion theism, atheism. What's your religion? Theism, atheism. Dvaita Advaita. 2, 1. Or our own tradition. Achintya Bheda Abheda. Inconceivable difference and oneness. It's like... So the truth is, there is no hard line in the sand. It's a lot more nuanced than that. It's a lot more nuanced. How are we like Krishna? One of the benefits of oneness is it does away with racism and sexism. And speciesism and all sorts of other stuff. Like, why is it that we have the right to kill animals? Because we're stronger? Well, what happens if aliens visit the earth and they're stronger than us? Should they be allowed to kill us? Well, no, because, we're smart. Okay, well, infants aren't smart. So should you be able to kill them? Well, no, but they have the potential for being smart. Okay, people with severe mental retardation never have the potential to be smart. Should we be allowed to kill them? Well, no. Why not? Because they're humans. Yeah, you're a speciesist. You have no logic. You just simply think that your people are better than everybody else, and so you can kill animals, but you can't kill your own. And aliens shouldn't kill you either, but you have no harm, you have no difficulty killing lesser animals, even though you can't point to any specific logic or coherent philosophy why one's okay and the other one's not. So one great thing about the oneness is it does away with things like racism and sexism and speciesism and stuff like that. A great thing about difference is it allows you to love people and feel empathy and compassion. There's good things about both of them. Just like there's good things about centralizing a business and bringing costs down, and there's good things about decentralizing a business and being super creative. There's good things about project management and the way it organizes everything, and there's a good thing about reassessing where you're coming from and questioning everything every month. There's good things about buying 5 equal presents for your children, and there's good things about using a more nuanced approach. There's good things about getting somewhere as quick as you want to get, and there's also something good about seeing the scenic route and just choosing the way you want to drive. Bubble tests are okay, but they're not the whole picture. That's why you add essay questions. Of course, now with ChatGPT, you can just take you 5 minutes to write a 100-page book report at whatever level you're supposed to be in. Write me a 100-page book report at a collegiate level, at a postdoc level, and put it together. You can still ultimately recognize unoriginal thought because it's just compiling stuff. And so I thought we'd look at a couple of verses. Really beautiful verses. Sarva bhutastam atmanam sarva bhutani chatmani ikshate yoga yuktatma sarvatra samadarshinaha. All right. Yoga yuktatma. Yoga yuktatma. A person who is yogad to yoga. Yukta means yogad. So a person who's yoked to yoga. The word yoke in English comes from the word yoga in Sanskrit. So a really nice translation would be a person who is yoked to yoga. Yoga yuktatma. But literally it would be more like a person who's yogad, linked to yoga, to being linked. Ikshate, they see. What do they see? Sarvatra samadarshinaha. They see everywhere, they see the same. Same thing everywhere. They see sarva bhuta stam atmanam. They see the self situated in all beings. And sarva bhutani chatmani. They see all beings situated in the self. The person who's yoked to yoga sees the same thing everywhere. They see the self situated in all beings, and they see all beings situated in the self. What does that mean? It's purposefully enigmatic, and it lends itself to a tremendous amount of commentary. There are verses surrounding it which will help you to better understand what's being spoken about, but the verse itself is very, very abstruse, very deep, very profound, and you can really run with it. You see that we're all spiritual beings. It could also mean that we are all literally one. It could mean either one. Which does this favor? Personalism or impersonalism? It kind of favors both. You'll see in a minute. You'd think it favors impersonalism at a glance, but actually favors both. Anyway, let's look at the next verse. Yo mam pashyati sarvatra sarvatra mayi pashyati tasyaham na pranashami sachame na pranashyati. Yo mam pashyati sarvatra. One who sees me everywhere. Sarvam cha mayi pashyati, and sees everything in me. One who sees me everywhere and who sees everywhere within me. One who sees me in everything and sees everything within me. That might be the best translation. One who sees me in everything and sees everything in me. Sarvatra means everywhere, and sarvam means everything. But there's a commonality in both words, and so rendered into English, it's almost better to say one who sees me in everything and everything in me, because it uses that same sarv base, this everything everywhere as being all together. It gets lost a little bit. Tasyaham na pranashyami. I'm not lost to them. I'm never lost to them. Why? Because they're seeing me everywhere and everything within me. And sachamen na pranashyati. And they're never lost to me. I'm never lost to them. They're never lost to me. When they see me everywhere and they see everything within me, I'm never lost to them and they're never lost to me. Does that verse favor personalism or impersonalism? That verse favors personalism. But actually they both do. And both verses exist side by side. So the first verse again. One who sees the self in all beings and all beings in the self. That yogi sees the same thing everywhere. And that yogi sees me everywhere and sees everything in relation to me. And I'm never lost to him and he's never lost to me. I think these verses are brilliant because they take these two basic ideas of personalism and impersonalism and they marry them together in a really wonderful way. The argument for Vaishnavism, the argument for Krishna, the argument for our tradition is not an argument against impersonalism. It's an argument for a more complete understanding of impersonalism, where you have things in common with God. How can you love somebody if you have nothing in common with them? How can you love a pig to the same level you love a human being? Pig has intelligence of a 3-year-old. Can you love a 3-year-old the same way you love a full adult? Maybe in the selfless thing it's good. But if love also creates vulnerability and intimacy, can you really take what a 3-year-old says very seriously? Can they challenge you and educate you? Maybe you can challenge and educate yourself in their association. But it's not that they're educating you. They're just being 3 and peeing their pants and defecating on themselves. They're being 3. Every 3-year-old has narcissistic personality disorder and 0 impulse control. Practically speaking, the very definition of being a child. Right? I mean, my children, that's my children right there. My son has been crying all night, and so I'm holding him crying, dead tired, holding him while he's crying in my ear. And then he's defecated on me while I'm holding him. Passed stool on me while I'm holding him. And then he's gotten upset at me while I'm cleaning the stool that he just passed on me, and cleaning him and patting his back and telling him it's going to be okay. And he's gotten angry at me and kicked at me, tried to hit me.
Yesterday.
And that happened yesterday. Because he was 1. So sometimes people think it's cool to say, oh yeah, I love a pig as much as I love a human being. Then you're severely crippled in your capacity for love. You are an extremely stunted individual, and you're probably a danger to yourself and others, and you need to be watched. Intimate love requires vulnerability. Vulnerability requires equality. Equality is the opposite of hegemonies, and relationships between a superior and an inferior being are fundamentally hegemonic. You love your dog is your slave. Your dog depends on you for life. It's going to die if you don't feed it. You follow? The relationship is extreme. It's an extreme power differential. You can put your dog down if you want to. You can kill it. To compare it to slavery is accurate. And so no, they love me so much. They have no choice. If love depends on free will, they don't have free will enough to choose to love you. They're instinctually hardwired to be devoted to you as a survival mechanism that's been bred into them over tens of thousands of years. Man's best friend was bred that way. Didn't make a choice. If love requires free will, they don't love you. You follow this? So if love is possible between us and God, and I'm going to argue it is, then we have to be godlike. We have to have a lot of things in common with God in order to create that potential for intimacy. Therefore, our oneness with God is not a threat to our ability to love God. In fact, it is the backdrop of that love being possible. So the problem isn't that we're one with God. The problem is when we become one with God to such an extent that there's no more possibility for an exchange of love, because remember again, love is a unifying force that makes two people one, but it's created against a backdrop of difference. There has to be a lover and a beloved in order for them to be in love with each other. If a mother and a child become one, and the woman no longer has a daughter or a son, then the love for that child goes out the window. Too much oneness, you can't love. Too little oneness, you can't love either. Without enough equality and oneness, you can't love. With too much oneness, you become literally one with the person, and now you can't love them either. Serious theology is working through these two polarities the same way you work through centralizing and decentralizing. The same way you work through so many polarities in life, and you balance so many things in life. Elegantly, poetically, even artistically. But it's not arbitrary. There's still good reason behind it. There's still deep thought behind it. And so we need a language of personalism and impersonalism which does not exist yet in Western philosophy, which is tragic because it enables you to teach and talk about and think about these things in a much more profound way. And it's vexing to me, actually, how deficient English is compared to Sanskrit in this precise way. At the same time, you can't marry yourself to those terms because those terms don't tell the whole story, because the whole story is much more fuzzy. And so deep theology is in the ability to balance concepts like oneness and difference in ways that allow for equality and love and intimacy to flourish. And the more perfect and more complete a conception of divinity is, the more it's able to have your cake and eat it too. The less it's subject to the law of contradiction, where a thing can't be itself and its opposite in the same way at the same time. The more it transcends that by showing you how you can take apparently contradictory qualities, but they're actually only paradoxically contradictory. You can show how they can be brought together. And the language of our traditions, Vishishta Advaita, variegated oneness. Vibhina Angsa, separated parts. Dvaita Advaita, oneness and difference. Shuddha Advaita, purified oneness. Achintya Bhed Abhed, inconceivable oneness and difference, are these attempts over thousands of years by hundreds of millions of our brethren to work through and show a very nuanced marriage of the benefits of being one with and similar to and divine-like, and the benefits of also not being God and being able to love God and embrace God, dance with God, serve God. And these two verses of the Gita, they walk this tightrope. They do this dexterous dance. They walk the razor's edge. Listen to them again. Sarva bhutastam atmanam. Sarva bhutani shatmani ikshate yoga yuktatma sarvacha samadarshina. The yoked yogi sees the same everywhere. They see the self in all beings and all beings in the self. And then, yomam pashyati sarvatra sarvam cha mayi pashyati tasyaham na pranashami sacha me na pranashyati. One who sees me everywhere and sees all things in me. For that person, I'm never lost. And they're also never lost to me. By speaking in languages, they're never lost to me and I'm never lost to them, it's concretizing the distinction between us and the deity. By saying that we see the same everywhere and we see all things in relation to the self and the self in relation to all beings, it's showing a oneness and a unity. Those two things can actually exist together. And we use, and we'll finish with this, we use metaphors to try and communicate this. Like sparks unto a flame. A spark is a separated part of a flame. It's distinct. It's also dependent on the flame for its fiery quality. But it can exist and float within the flame and have its own individual unique existence while at the same time still being fire-like. Still being flammable, still being inflamed. And yet also existing independently. And at the same time, dependently. It's concrete and dependent. It's distinct and yet it's part of the other thing. We use an example, or like photons to the sun. What is a photon? But some differentiated heat and light from the sun. But yet we can speak about photons as being separate from the sun. But at the same time, they are the sun's energy, are in many ways exactly the same as the sun in quality, just different in quality. They're derivative of the sun. They're sun-like. They're fragments of the sun. And so our tradition, when trying to explain these complicated truths, uses these very, very simple metaphors. And here's another one. This is perhaps the best one in all of existence. And it's also used in the Gita. Krishna says, and this doctrine is called panentheism, which is a term that entered the English language in 1850-something by the guy who founded Indiana University. He's a Protestant minister. But it's existed in Sanskrit for thousands of years, panentheism. Everything within the deity. Krishna makes this point when he says, Te mai na te shvaham. You are in me, I am not in you. You are in me, I am not in you. Because there's these two competing concepts of transcendence and immanence, where you want things to be right in front of you, immanent. At the same time, you're looking to show God as being transcendent, beyond this world. If God's too transcendent, then everybody's just waiting for the deluge or the fire or the flood or jihad in order to go back to heaven, and this world becomes horrible. And if it's too imminent, you never want to leave this world either. And so the best tradition has elements of immanence, where you can see God in this world, and elements of transcendence, where you can also let go of this world and go beyond this world. Panentheism is the doctrine that allows for those two opposites to be married together. That everything isn't God, that's pantheism. Everything is within God, panentheism. Everything within God. And Krishna makes a beautiful analogy. Just like air, oxygen, exists within space, but space exists beyond the oxygen that inhabits it temporarily. You have wind, or like a foul odor, or oxygen, or whatever, in a given space. And those two things seem to be the same. But actually you can suck all that air out of that space and create a vacuum, and the space still exists independently. And even though something was occupying within it, it still retained its transcendent quality, where it was never tainted. The same way water, if you mix it with mud, is not on a molecular level tainted. It still can be made potable again through distillation. Similarly, that space ever remains transcendent to the air which happens to be occupying it, which to us seems to be synonymous. Therefore, the world exists within divinity, and divinity can still exist beyond this world. In the same way that unity and distinction both have value, centralizing and decentralizing within business both have value. Bubble tests have utility, as do essay questions. Polarity management has incredible, immense value, and it can always be done with good thought and good reason. Similarly, even concepts like our relationship to divinity, how God-like we are, how divine-like we are, how not divine-like we are, where are the differences, where are the distinctions. If you marry these things together in a proper way, you end up with a beautiful theology where you truly can have your cake and eat it too. You can be one with God, but not so one you can't reach out and love God or embrace God. Okay, that's it. Thank you so much. Let's do a locator now.